Is that good, Justine? Okay, awesome. Well, let's get started. My name is Matt Landon. I'm a librarian for Pima County Public Library. I coordinate programming for youth and adults, focusing on the arts and humanities, as well as issues of economic justice. If you haven't already, put the name of the organization you work for in the chat as a way to introduce yourself. We are here to talk about Matthew Desmond's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, and relate the ideas in the book to our work as government and social service agency employees. The overarching questions for the next 90 minutes are, how has the eviction crisis impacted our community, and how can we respond in the coming months? So turn your camera on if you can. Please use the raise your hand feature if you want to speak, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Let's respect each other's time and try to keep our comments brief and to the point. Does anybody have any questions about how Zoom functions before we get going? Okay. Facilitating our discussion today is Bonnie Bazata from the Pima County Ending Poverty Now office. Bonnie has long been active on this issue and convenes a weekly eviction prevention collaboration meeting with a regular attendance of over 50 professionals. Co-facilitating the discussion is Justine Hernandez, founder of the Seed Library at Pima County Public Library. Under her guidance, the library has been lending seeds and supporting community gardening since 2012. Also joining us is Kara Mills from the Green Valley Library, who will be monitoring the chat today. All right, take it away, Bonnie and Justine.
Justine, you're muted.
How about this?
Perfect.
Okay, all right. New technology, new headphones. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for the book discussion. I know there may be a few folks who have not yet had a chance to get to or even finish the book. So I just wanted to give a quick little synopsis of the book before we get started. So Evicted is the book by sociologist Matthew Desmond. It's his chronicle of 8 families that are living in Milwaukee's poorest neighborhoods. And he follows them as they sort of navigate eviction in their communities. Desmond's work serves to highlight the issues of extreme poverty and affordable housing, as well as the economic exploitation that follows poverty here in the United States. With each story told, the entangled relationship between the cycle of eviction and the ensuing cycle of instability that families and individuals face comes into sharper focus for us. So, and with that, I will pass it on to Bonnie.
Hi, everybody. So glad you're with us today for this really important conversation. And I want to recognize that we're really fortunate to have a number of people on the call who have some expertise in this area, who are here. So what we really want to have is a really engaged conversation. And we know that the book is kind of a launching pad for us, right? But we probably have a lot of the conversation is going to be talking about what's going on in our community today. So I'd really like to welcome and recognize Tom Litwicki, who's the CEO for Old Pueblo Community Services, and he's here also representing the Tucson Pima Collaboration and Homelessness. We have Peggy Hutchison, who's the CEO of Primavera Foundation, Chris Gruninger, who's with the Arizona Bar Foundation, a statewide effort, Michelle Crow, who's the Southern Arizona Director for the Children's Action Alliance. We have Arina Delic, who's with our Community Action Agency, so she's someone on the front lines. And we have from the Constable's Office, Constable Bennett Bernal, and Nareen Jabro, who's a recent addition to the office as social worker. So it's been wonderful to have her, working directly and trying to work with people. And I see too, we have a couple of members, Joe Feynman and others with the Public Defender's Services Office, and others on the call, Eric Schindler with Child and Family Resources, Genevieve James with Pasquayaki, employment services. So lots of people on this call with a deep history and investment in the conversation around poverty, evictions, social services. So this is really our opportunity today to dig deeper into this conversation. So I think with that, I'd like to kind of open it up. I think we have some discussion questions, Matt, right? And do you want me to lead with those, or Justine, do you want to open those up?
I think if we lead with one question and then just open it up after that, yeah.
Okay, Justine, do you want to do that, or do you want me to?
Sure, we can alternate. I'm happy to start with one of the first questions that we had wanted to kind of put to folks, if you'd like. And sort of one of the first questions that we sort of considered are that there are questions relating to this current situation. So I guess, yeah, putting it out there, are there questions that folks might have relating to the current situation with evictions during this pandemic? So for example, not many people realize that the existing moratorium does not protect people from going through an eviction hearing and getting a negative judgment. It only protects at the point of enforcement. So how do we think this is and will be impacting the people behind on rent in Pima County?
Hi, Justine, this is Chris Groninger, and I'll just say that this is probably one of the scariest things that I see coming for all of us to deal with, which is that, you know, a lot of tenants who have faced eviction or are currently, you know, have already received a judgment for eviction do not realize that even if, you know, no matter what, because they have that judgment already, that their tenancy is in effect terminated. So I think April 1st, should the CDC order not be extended, we will see a wave of people who are unexpectedly or not sure that they are actually going to be locked out.
Yeah, thank you for that, Chris. You know, in the conversations, particularly over the last year around evictions, there's always been this debate around how many people are evicted but never show up in the courts, right? So we use the courts numbers as a way to kind of count the number of people who are in an eviction process. And the Arizona Multi-Housing Association will tell you that maybe 10% of those end up not getting evicted because they work out something with their landlords. But I've always been curious as to how many people get, you know, self-evict or, you know, leave before it becomes a formal eviction, right? And it's interesting in Desmond's book, I think he says 43% of the sort of total number of evictions, I think it's 43% happen before the court process, right? So if we're looking at the numbers we're counting of people who are going through eviction, also remembering the folks who are getting evicted or self-evicting before they even make it into a court process. And Chris, I don't know if that matches up with some of the work and research that you've done, or other people on the call.
We don't have data on folks that have evicted or removed themselves from the property prior to the court filing or you know, an eviction complaint being filed, unfortunately.
Does anybody know the total number of evictions, official court proceeded evictions last year in Pima County?
I do. I'm gonna dig those numbers up so I can be accurate while we carry on here. Hang on a minute, I'll get those for you.
Yeah, and while we're looking at that, and I think a lot of us were sort of wondering, you know, in the book, Desmond sort of makes a point of talking about evictions in the past, historically, you know, and centuries ago, how tenants that were facing evictions and poor housing conditions kind of saw themselves in solidarity with one another, and unified together in protest to fight for fair and affordable housing. Whereas today the notion of there's a sort of universal sense that folks facing eviction and living in poverty, that there's this often deserved and that it's thought to be the outcome of an individual failure. And so even among the folks who are in those communities themselves who have previously faced eviction, so I'm wondering too, now with this kind of threat of eviction during the pandemic, if we think that the evictions happening under this veil of the pandemic might change kind of those perceptions of eviction, if we might see things differently than the sort of the way, again, we view it as this individual failing, that people, it's a deserved sort of thing. And do you think this, because it affects a different sort of a wider breadth of folks, if it might change the perceptions? Does anybody have any sense of that, and in the communities that they're working in? And
sorry, I'm trying to raise my hand, but I can't find the icon. I mean, but that's purposeful, right? I mean, I don't think that it sort of naturally evolved that people who are being evicted were seen as deserving. I mean, I think that's the end result of a very, very purposeful ideology, whose end result we're seeing play out now, which is almost half of Congress voting against any form of eviction relief or COVID relief. So I don't think it changes. I think it actually is accomplishing, well, despite their best efforts, maybe not, but hopefully accomplishing what certain people wanted it to accomplish, which is preventing relief from people who need it by convincing the people who don't that the people who need it don't actually need it because they're lazy and undeserving of help.
Sure. Yeah, it's by design. Do you think that there's anything that we can do in our work capacities to kind of address that?
I think stressing what you just said, which is that it's by design. I mean, I'll always bring it back to that this is a feature, not a bug, would be one tactic.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I've got those numbers. I'm going to share my screen so everybody can see. That's okay. There we go. We can see the numbers from 2018, 2019, and 2020. So we're, prior to the pandemic, right? We were somewhere between 12,500 and inching toward 13,000. And now, of course, we've seen a drop because of the moratoriums in 2020, but we know there's a lot of people who have eviction judgments, but don't have writs of execution, right? Or landlords are not taking people to court now because of the moratorium. So. I also, if I could, I'd like to share this screen with you. And this is sort of what we started with, is just, few tenants understand, and most people don't understand, when you hear the word moratorium, you assume that it stops any kind of eviction proceeding. But in fact, the moratorium only stops after the point of judgment. So it's really confusing. And I know I've talked to a number of tenants over the many months who assume that they have to leave because they've got a judgment, right? But the way both the state and the federal moratoriums are written, it's only somewhere around at post judgment, which means many times it puts it in the hands of our constables. And I know we have Bennett on the call and Noreen on the call to step in and sort of inform and educate the tenant that they in fact don't have to move out, that they can stay in their residence, but they also already have a judgment on their record, right? So it gets very complicated, and it's a really, a negative thing for a tenant to have a judgment on their record.
Yeah, I mean, if it wasn't for the constables like Kristen and Bennett, a lot of people, unless they're really able to self-advocate, they don't know that they can stay in their home because they qualify for protection under the moratorium.
Yeah, that was a really sort of glaring thing in the stories that were told in the book, was that the sort of lack of agency on the part of a lot of these folks is just not knowing how to advocate themselves, and sort of that acceptance of that this was how things were, rather than kind of making a case for themselves. That's just sort of, again, that notion that they are deserving of this fate.
We also have a situation, and I'm sure Chris can speak about this maybe at a state level too, where depending on the judge you get in justice court, and depending on the steps you've taken prior to coming to court, you may get a different outcome. So the CDC moratorium requires that you submit a declaration form to your landlord, that you apply for rent assistance, that you discuss a payment plan. And so if people don't know that they have to do those three things at a minimum, right, to be sort of in compliance, some judges are saying, hey, Eric, I need you now to do these things in order for you to be in compliance. And some judges are saying, sorry, you didn't do these things, so you're going to get evicted. And sometimes, as Narina said, a constable will step in and say, actually, if you do these things now, then I'll let you stay in your home. But there's lots of variables in there as to whether the eviction process results in the person getting evicted. And sometimes, landlords, I've dealt with one young mother now who has 4 children, one born this fall, who's had 2 eviction proceedings started on her in her apartment complex. And both times, fortunately, she called me and I said, no, do take these steps and you'll be good. And even though she did that the first time, the second time, the management company led her to believe that she still had to leave. And so, we had to walk back through that process. So, it's really a crapshoot as to, whether someone's going to end up getting evicted or not. It depends so much on who intervenes at what point in the process. Chris, would you say the same thing's happening in other jurisdictions?
Absolutely. In fact, I think the thing that seems to make the biggest difference is how knowledgeable the type of person in a help position tends to be around eviction, just the same as you helping the woman who needed to hear that that's not what that meant, or that's not how that works. Most people go without hearing that at any point. And so having judges who have different views or approaches on the bench, we've seen in Maricopa County that there are some courts that make a practice of regularly continuing cases. The court has done a much better job in trying to outline that in administrative orders to justices of the peace to say, these are the scripts, these are the things that you can say, these are the things you should let tenants know. But as we all know, that process and that court hearing happens so fast that 1, if you don't have people there, or 2, even if you do, the timing and the amount of time available to you to talk with someone about what they're experiencing and help stop what's happening is very, very limited.
Yeah. And we're sitting here now, a few weeks before the end of March, when yet another moratorium is about to expire. moratorium 5. I mean, we've had 2 state moratoriums, a federal moratorium, which is on its 3rd extension, hopefully making a 4th extension, but it's a lot of uncertainty for people.
I'm concerned about when this moratorium finally ends, whenever it ends, that there will be a tsunami of evictions that have already been judged and only waiting to be carried out. What's to prevent thousands of people from being put out on the street on the day after the moratorium ends?
Well, and I'll let others on the call speak to this too, but the most important thing we can do is get the rent assistance out the door. And we do have a pretty big pot right now, thanks to the last passage, and now with the American Rescue Plan, we'll be seeing a lot of money coming into the community for rent assistance, and it's allowing us to pay 12 months back and 3 months forward. And I love the 3 months forward because, you know, that gives people time to get back to work, get back on their feet, get some money back in their pipeline. But right now we have over 4,000 people on our waiting in queue to get that. And I see Alina's coming back in, so I can ask her about this as well. But you know, it takes time to process these applications, and there's more documentation requirements for this next round of funding. So it always takes a little more time to get through, and to help people, you know, in a virtual world, upload their documents. And, you know, it depends on, can you still pay for your internet? Do you have enough technological savvy to know how to do that? So we've got I think Pima County's done some really positive things, and our nonprofit partners have really stepped up to get a more efficient system going. But we figure it's going to take a couple of months just to work through the backlog of what we have. And we really haven't done a lot of extensive outreach about rent assistance. We're getting ready to do more, but you know, presumably there'll be more people who will need to sign up. And some of these folks got rent assistance in the fall, right? But they're still not working, so now they're back in the queue. So I think to your point, Matt, the best thing we can do is try to get that rent assistance out the door so that people can, you know, stay housed. But it's going to take time, and it will definitely exceed the end of March without a question.
I think it's, if you don't mind, Bonnie, this is Chris, and I think it's really important for everyone to know that if a judgment is in place, that tenancy is terminated. Even if rental assistance helps, a lot of people have included, like DES has language that says that after 30, you know, you can proceed with the eviction 30 days after receiving rental assistance. And we've asked for clarification to say, you know, okay, so I receive a rent check in April. Per your rules, it means that 30 days later you can do an eviction if, you know, there's nothing really that stops that aside from that 30 days, even if rent is paid forward or backward. And the thing that happens, and that we all have to know, is that rental assistance is really important, but not necessarily to keep somebody in their home. It helps to address the deficit that they already owe. And so having that judgment follow them, having their credit ruined, those are big impacts on future housing stability. And so, and what kind of housing you live in. And so when working with tenants, I think it's really important on rental assistance to say, make sure this judgment is cleared. Here's, you know, the information that you'd need to know that going forward, because the rental assistance will help clear that area, but it's not going to help them stay in the home that they currently have. And so when I say, I don't mean to be alarmist, but on April 1st, if there's nothing else there, we're talking about tens of thousands of people across the state that are pending a lockout right now. And we don't have firm numbers because that's constables, and constables are different. That's courts, and they have writs, maybe that they know how many that they've issued, but not how many will be executed once that happens. So, you know, again, not to be alarmist, but it is a big problem that's going to happen whenever the moratorium ends, because that means those lockouts are ready to happen.
Wow. Joel, I see you got your hand up.
Yeah.
And Noreen.
figured out the hand emoji. Well, I mean, alarmism is my specialty, so I will lean into it. You know, the other concern is that we have an exponential increase in the number of evictions for material breach. So landlords are getting around
Yes.
non-payment by not alleging non-payment, by alleging material breach, which can be anything from marijuana use to unauthorized guests to vehicles in the front yard. And, you know, the figures that I have provided by the county administrator, you know, the evictions for these purposes went from 1.9% in 2019 to 8.7% in 2020. So, you know, a 7-fold increase. So even with rental insurance, if landlords are figuring out ways to evict people who can pay their rent, but they just don't like in their properties, then that introduces a whole new host of issues.
Nahareen?
I've been pretty anxious about this, you know, with the moratorium coming to an end and possibly not being extended, you know, thinking about some of the people who do already have, you know, a writ and, you know, they're in line for rental assistance, but I fear that they're still going to be evicted. I just wanted to say that I do have some hope with some of that rent that's being paid forward, that some of these landlords may, you know, have some buy-in with that rent that's being paid forward. If hopefully there's a good relationship with the landlord and the tenant, or maybe the landlord just, you know, wants to keep getting that steady rent for a few more months. But, you know, that's definitely something that I've been anxious about, trying to get families who I know are not guaranteed to stay in their house because there's already a writ, in programs like, you know, Salvation Army and Our Family Services. It's just, you know, some of these programs, they're really slow and you have to already be homeless in order to qualify for them. So it's really difficult to get people in. We have to utilize emergency housing, like people getting into, you know, a shelter or using hotel funds. So, you know, I feel like it's going to get really messy if the moratorium isn't extended. I feel like we need at least until, you know, the not just the end of these funds, but the end of, you know, the next relief package. And then the other thing I was going to say is that a lot of these landlords are going to have to refile these writs because a lot of them have already expired. They expire after 45 days. So that gives us a little bit of time to.
I'm gonna ask Tom and Peggy in just a minute to talk to us a little bit about the emergency housing and emergency shelter situation in Pima County. But before I do that, I just want to mention a couple things. So, like, if your head is spinning a little bit right now as you're hearing people talk about, you know, all this material breaches and you know, it's complicated. It's confusing, right? I keep feeling like I want to go for a law degree after this year because I've been learning so much. But I just want to clarify a point Joe made. So material breach is a breach of contract, right? So most people breach their contract because they can't pay their rent. That's non-payment of rent, right? And that's in a normal year, that's like 95% of the cases. But you can also break your contract on a whole bunch of other ways, right? Like if you have pets and you're not supposed to have pets, people moved in with you or whatever, you know, like most contracts, leases are multi-pages with, you know, item after item of how you can break a contract. And so what we're seeing is more landlords coming to court and saying exactly what Joe was saying, like, oh, Amber has pets now, or they're parking too many cars in the driveway, or they've got boxes on their porch, or, you know, something else. And I've been trying to track these numbers. So we went from like maybe 4 or 5% to closer to 18, 19% of cases that are now, because the moratorium doesn't protect these other material breaches. It only protects for non-payment of rent. But Chris, you made it. This was a wrinkle I didn't realize when you were talking about the fact that it doesn't matter that you've gotten rent assistance and you paid your back rent. If you have a judgment, you can still be evicted within 30 days. So I'd like to ask you to clarify that, and also then let me know if you, so for our rent assistance in Pima County, we require that landlords vacate the judgment when they've received rent assistance, which means you go back to court and you remove the judgment, right? Because that's a real negative hit. So Chris, if landlords do that, then does that
It does not
kind of release them
reinstate,
from that situation?
it does not reinstate the lease. By going back to court and vacating a judgment, or most of them will say that the judgment was satisfied rather than vacating it. And even if they did vacate it, it doesn't reinstate the lease. And so that lease is broken upon judgment. If the landlord chooses to enter into a lease again with that tenant, then they can, but that doesn't mean that they will. So I think that's something important to know. And then to Joel's point, which I think is really important to remember, there's a lot of things we can do to help tenants when they have a material breach of their lease. I've seen the most ridiculous I think I saw was a candy wrapper or a granola bar wrapper that a child had dropped out of their backpack when they were coming home from school, and it sat on the porch. And what you need to listen for are those things where they say impeded the well-being and the enjoyment of other tenants. So you can throw anything under that. I mean, that can be loud music. It can be a granola bar wrapper on the sidewalk. It doesn't matter. But it's important for advocates or people that work with tenants to know that they can, that tenants have a voice there. The part that we're also seeing is a shift from those, non-compliance with the lease to an immediate breach. And an immediate breach happens instantly. So you get a summons, and usually your hearing date is within a day or two. Once you get to court, if the judge decides that you have violated, had committed a serious crime or impacted the health and safety of other residents, you can be gone within 24 hours. We're seeing an increase in those across the state. So we're not just talking about material breaches or violations of the lease that are fixable. We're talking about things that can't be fixed by the tenant, that it is an immediate removal from the property. And so that's a devastating days-long process that impacts people in the worst possible way. And that is a way around non-payment issues that we've seen happen over and over again. So it's important to know all of those types of terms and ways that frankly, eviction are happening right now more than they are or ever have before. I've heard people, a lot of landlords have taken to alleging that the tenant is a drug dealer, and this is not proven in a court of law. There's no, police involvement at all. It's just saying that there's people coming and going, so they must be dealing drugs and being effective in securing an eviction based on that alone. Just an allegation.
Diane, I've got your hand up. I'm going to call you just 1 second, though. I do want to just share my screen real quick. And I want to thank you, Chris. I learned another new thing that I didn't realize. I thought I had it all figured out about this eviction process. But Chris's organization has developed a really great website, and I'm showing you one clip. It has both statewide rent assistance resources, but it also has a door you can go through and walks you through an eviction process, and really does a nice job of giving you good, solid information on a complicated process. And so I encourage you to go to AZ Eviction Help and look at that and educate yourself and help other people connect to it as well. Diane, you had your hand up.
I did, thank you. And I'm calling in from my phone, so I'm having a hard time with my screen. But I work in the Pima County School Superintendent's Office, so I'm viewing this issue of homelessness from the lens of an educator, and also as the mission chair at on the Desert Mission Team, and our focus is reducing homelessness. So I'm here on 2 levels. But you just answered one of my questions, and one is for those who this isn't our first language, how can we understand the key vocabulary in the process? And it sounds like you just answered that with the AZ Eviction. Health.com, is that what that address is, that we would want to go to learn the key vocabulary and the process so we could increase our understanding of what that looks like?
I'm
Yes,
putting the link in the chat.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And then the other thing is and we do a lot to support, we've got a couple agencies here of what our mission team supports, but we do a lot to support just the agencies in town. But as school personnel, what's a good link for me to have to be able to give to counselors, and I'm sure a lot of people already have this, but just for my own knowledge, to learn more about how we can continue to support students in the community. What's a couple of questions. Who do we reach out to learn about what Pima County specifically is doing? And I'm just so darn proud of Pima County through this COVID stuff. I can't even tell you, but how do we find out the resources that Pima County specifically are offering for support?
Diane, why don't you reach out to me, and I'd be glad to help guide you to the right connections or fill in any holes, get answers that you need. And we also have a Monday morning weekly meeting for an eviction prevention collaboration, which many people on this call are participate in, to just try to stay on top of what's happening and how to respond. And we do have a working group right now that's talking about how to better connect to schools. So we'd love your help. So how we can make sure we can get information out to the schools, the teachers, the counselors who are often on the front lines with families. So families know where to go for help. So Diane, I'm going to put my information in the chat, and please reach out and we'll connect around that.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so very much. And with that, I yield back the floor. I just had to use that language.
And Bonnie, do you mind if I share too? It's not, it's open to anybody who wants to attend. And because you mentioned schools specifically, I thought you might find it interesting that we're doing we have 2 different trainings scheduled for next week, which is anybody who wants to help, or anybody who cares about evictions that are happening are welcome to attend. We have a number of school district representatives and individual schools that counselors and guidance counselors are attending. I put a link to register for that training into the chat right underneath the AZ Eviction Help website link. So I'll also put my contact information. And just to echo, because I don't think that you guys maybe hear it enough, but somebody that's not in Pima County, I can tell you that I'm so very impressed with the collaboration, the community, and basically just the encouragement that you give each other's and those in your community to get through tough times. So it's been amazing to kind of watch from a distance, but also to be included in the conversation. So thank you.
Well, Chris, you've been tremendous help. And, you know, as you hear in this conversation, there are so many details that most of us who are not lawyers, right? We're trying to figure out how to navigate this incredibly complicated system. So having state experts like Chris so available to us makes a huge difference. And Megan, I see your hands up.
Well, I don't like to be alarmist either, but I'm just wondering, given the short time frame and the huge number of people, has anyone considered finding a very large area for people to safely stay while they get assistance? I realize funding is coming, but going back last April and May, watching folks go through that rental assistance process, it took, 6, 7, 8 weeks. And I just, I don't have any power to do that, but it just seems for this, emergency backup plan. Hopefully it won't happen, but just having somewhere for people to go. Anyway, I don't know if anyone's discussed that or even if it's possible, but it seems like having that plan in place would be very helpful.
Well, I'm going to circle back to Peggy and Tom to respond to that, and maybe just kind of give us a picture of what's happening on that end of the community with the needs for emergency shelter and transition to better housing.
I was going to suggest the state capitol as a place for folks to go because we really have to get to systems change. And we have to get to the point where a safe place to call home is a human right. So kind of, to change the paradigm before I get into that, I think, Joel was talking about this antiquated pull oneself up by one's bootstraps. And if you don't do that, then it's your fault, it's your failure, as opposed to looking at, where's a healthy public sector where the public sector invests in the common good and ensures that everyone has a safe place to call home, and the home is really the center of people being able to work, people having adequate public education, public safety that includes equity and justice, health and well-being, all of those things. So, and, I think Matt Desmond talks about that. So we do have to, early on the question was asked, well, what can we do? Well, yes, we have to continue to provide support to people, but we have to get to another place where we're really talking about what is a human right in this country. And, it's, if people only want to think of it in financial terms, it's a really big return on investment if we ensure everybody has a safe place to call home, but it's also the right thing to do. I don't know what you think, Tom, but our emergency shelter and support system is totally oversubscribed. There's just not enough, so we have, drop-in programs to get, access into trying to get immediate shelter. Yeah, we all have a focus on housing first, but quite frankly, we don't have enough units in our community. And we're losing more and more with gentrification and predatory developers or purchasers coming in, buying and flipping units. And we've, it's been reported in the Star, it's nothing new, it's happening across the country. So, our shelter system, we have people waiting on lists just to get basic shelter. Whether it's getting into congregate shelter, which we've had to make smaller because of COVID, right? We can't have as many people in a congregate shelter. So that's a challenge. We have to make sure that we do the COVID testing and we make sure that everyone's safe and healthy. To, using motels, we're using that. Those of us that are doing shelter for families, we're doing it in scattered site units where the lease is in the name of the organization, say our Family Services or Primavera Foundation for 90 days. And then it goes into the family so they don't have to continue moving. The stress and trauma of ongoing moving at, one place to another is just ridiculous. Now we're finding it's really hard to find landlords that will rent to us for 90 days and then switch it into somebody else's name. It's for rapid rehousing. That's where folks identify the unit they want to live in and we're able to pay, multiple months rent. Again, landlords, why would they're raising their rent. So that's one challenge, right? Secondly, if somebody has an eviction on their record or, some other kind of background check that prevents them, landlords don't want to rent to them. So our staff, instead of just doing kind of transactional work, they have to do relational work, right? They have to try to convince landlords. If we're doing eviction prevention, we're landlords that they have to give us their tax ID number. A lot of landlords aren't paying taxes. So they'll say, oh yeah, we want the rent assistance, but we're not going to give you the tax ID. Well, we have to get the tax ID. So it becomes our work, our systems are already messed up, right? Unemployment, whatever, but then even the systems for doing eviction prevention or rapid rehousing or, any of this are kind of backed up as well, not just because of the paperwork required, but because it's requiring convincing landlords to work with us. I'm trying to convince landlords to get rid of that writ, right? It's it's just takes a lot of time, and where we might want an assembly line because we want to get as many people through the system as possible, it's not always, we can't always do that. So all of our systems are oversubscribed, and we're already in a tsunami from my perspective. So what's going to happen April 1st, or even if that's extended? So, our work has to be bringing voices forward. It has to be addressing the system and really getting to that place where what is the role of government? It's to ensure living wage, to ensure everybody has a safe place to live. So I'll stop. Tom, you better move in so I can get off my.
Open up space for me to. I concur with a lot of what Peggy has just said, and I won't repeat that. I think a little background, I'm representing two entities, one being Tucson Pima Collaboration and Homelessness, and one being an organization called OPCS, or Old Public Community Services. So TPCH, if you're not familiar with it, is essentially a governance organization which manages a significant chunk of HUD funds that come to the community, and they push that money out to nonprofits and then govern that funding and the use of that funding through various governance policies and procedures and monitoring and things like that. The majority of the money that goes out is for permanent housing vouchers in one form or another, so subsidy vouchers for folks, and then the support around that. And TPCH, like a lot of organizations, is going through a lot of systems change. OPCS is a housing and service provider, so we provide housing and behavioral health services to those who want them. We essentially have low barrier we have outreach folks and navigators in the community, and then we have 116 beds of low barrier shelter. It's like bridge housing. So instead of a congregate shelter, we have apartments, and people live in those apartments, and then we help them get into other apartments and get a lease in their name into permanent housing. And the permanent housing is voucher based. That's really what we think is the way to go. And we have around 327 units of that available. I say units, they're really just vouchers that we can give to people and help them get their own unit. So we think it's really important because we're prioritizing. We're in this crisis mode. We're prioritizing as an entity to work with those folks who are most likely to die, to perish homeless. And so we're looking for folks who have chronic continual homelessness, have mental health conditions, have barriers to typical shelter, like maybe a pet or a partner, or lots of other reasons that they really could use that extra attention. We work with about 1,200 households to 1,500 households a year. And we have about 800 or so go into permanent housing every year. Where really that's our one measure of success, is how many people as an agency can we get into permanent housing and try and keep in permanent housing. So the case management and the navigation to get through the system, truly our value add that we add to the whole system is to help people move through the bureaucracy. So having someone who can help them move through the bureaucracy, and frankly, as an organization, we're now in more of a learning mode in how, and have been for the last year and a half, on how to help prevent people from eviction. So, how to get it so that they don't have an eviction on their record. How can we negotiate with that landlord? How can we work with the landlord before it gets to that point? How can we then put them back into some sort of temporary housing and get them into a new unit, or keep them in the unit they're at? So that's kind of what we do. I put a couple things in the chat. One is there's a University of Arizona Southwest Institute for Research on Women last year put out a pretty nice report on evictions and the pending evictions. And now they have come back to TPCH and provided a presentation, an update to that on February 11th. So if you follow that link, you should be able to get to the website and the update. In brief, his message was around eviction that It's better than it was going to be in their initial prediction because of the amount of money that has been put out there. And that if more money continues to be put out there, the actual immediate kind of crisis, might not be as bad as they had thought, which they said with much trepidation and kind of, gee, hate to even, it seems weird to even say such a thing. But I'll let you look at that because I'm certainly not an expert on that. The other thing I put on there was the TPCH website and the organization, the Help Tucson website. But it really resonates with me what Peggy said, and that is this, I've been doing this position, now this CEO position for about 6 years, and this trying to transition an organization and nonprofits in general around homelessness and housing to move out of crisis and to stop managing problems. You're always going to have to manage problems, and trying to move from managing problems to actually developing solutions. And that gets you to those much bigger solutions that Peggy was mentioning and talking about. Is affordable, safe housing, a right? And if it is, well, gosh, how much do we need, and how do we figure that out? So it seems like we're spending all of our resources so often on crisis that there aren't any resources left to kind of get your head above water and look around and say, well, if we had to put a dollar amount on it, what do we need? How much do we need? Where do we need it? What would be the strategy? And there's a lot of systemic things that I think create that. A lot of, competition between entities and things like that creates this kind of environment where we do this and they do that. It struck me, I can be kind of dramatic sometimes, but I walk to work, and so I meet and talk with folks who have serious mental illness and are homeless on my walk to work through downtown every day. And it's always amazing to me, myself included, that we'd have these luncheons. Nonprofits love luncheons, right? Everyone else hates them, we love them. And so people would come, and my luncheon, I would say what great things OPCS did. Someone else's organization would say what great things they did, and on and on and on. And then we do our street count, which is not perfect, but it's one measure. And lo and behold, chronic homelessness went up by 150 people. Well, how the hell could everyone be doing so good and chronic homelessness just went up? Now, there's a lot of reasons that could happen, but being able to look at it from that higher level and that systems level and saying, wait a minute, what are we missing? And looking at that honestly and saying, how do we address this as a system, and those paradigm changes that need to come with that system. There's no doubt it's the smartest thing to do financially, and it's the most compassionate thing to do. But it does take a front end investment, and it does take that overall look. And I don't know about anyone else, but it seems like I came from the behavioral health system, but behavioral health system and the housing system seems to have just been in continual crisis. And so it gets to where crisis thinking and crisis management is the norm, and being able to step above beyond that. And I know Peggy has done that with Primavera quite well, and being able to look at some of those other community systemic changes that need to happen. Now I better stop, or I'll be talking forever.
Bonnie, if we're talking about investments, can I add something to that conversation?
Please.
I think one thing that's important to consider going forward is, we're clearly not out of the pandemic, but if we move into a post-COVID world, one thing that is really helpful for people is legal help. While I feel like I can say this because I'm not a lawyer, that lawyers are amazing and are basic human needs when it comes to poverty. If you talk about somebody not paying their rent, there's usually a reason why, and that might be child support wasn't paid, and so that's a legal problem. It might be that there was a glitch in their benefits, and that's a legal problem. There's tons of legal problems that contribute to homelessness that could be easily solved by supporting legal aid, free legal services in the community. I know you guys have a great program, a couple of them actually, in Pima County. And so I think to the extent that you're able to, when we're talking about navigating and helping people facing eviction, if you have a landlord, if you picture the scales of justice and you have a landlord with an attorney on one side of those scales, and you try to put a tenant and a bunch of non-lawyers in that other scale, you're never going to create balance, because a lawyer needs to have, if you're going to create balance, there has to be a lawyer that's on both sides. Each side has to have equal access to justice. And so I think if you're looking at ways to improve and invest in the community going forward, legal aid is a huge bang for your buck, because it can contribute to, eliminating unnecessary homelessness, or getting an intervention with legal aid beforehand can address a number of basic need issues. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation as well.
And in that vein, really quickly, I just wanted to put it out there. I wondered if anybody could speak to, I know that they have been reimagining the eviction court process and, having representation for folks. And one of the things in one of the interviews that that Matt shared with Matthew Desmond, he talked about the simple act of one, having kind of a dedicated judge who, is kind of understands that process, but even just asking the question, kind of what happened that what happened in your life, what events happened, was a really kind of a meaningful thing. And I wonder if anybody is familiar with and can speak to kind of what's happening, what's changed in terms of the eviction court process here in Pima County, and if those are the kinds of things that are on the radar of the folks in the court.
I'd love, if I could, Justine, talk to that, speak to that, because I've been working on that a bit. But I want to just first of all thank Tom and Peggy for that, and for reminding us of the big picture, like housing is a human right, right? Like, let's start there, and let's look at the systemic pieces that Tom was talking about. I do a training on poverty, and I bring in some of the research from behavioral scientists who say in conditions of scarcity, we all behave the same, right? It doesn't matter where you're at. And so when we're constantly under-resourced and underfunded, we get into that crisis orientation all the time. And that keeps pulling our energy and attention away from being able to look at the bigger picture and figure out how we address that. So thank you both. And I also want to read to you in a minute, as we've been in this conversation, I've had a chance to work with a number of people facing evictions, and somebody I helped this summer just reached out to me. So I want to read his email too. But to Justine's question, and again, to think about some maybe systemic solutions, we've been discussing this idea of an eviction diversion program, right? So the idea is, let's divert people from ever getting to court. And that, and I totally agree with Chris, like those legal tools are so important. But at the end of the day, poverty and racism are huge, and the lack of affordable housing are huge drivers of eviction. And so if you can't pay the rent, you can't pay the rent, right? So if we're able to give people a place to come to where there can be a number of tools in the toolbox. So there can be social support services, right? There can be job assistance, there can be mediation and education and rent assistance, so we can make tenant and landlord whole before they even have to get into the eviction process. And then when none of those work, having legal representation there as one of the tools. And then being able to get in front of a judge who's knowledgeable and compassionate and is looking at the bigger picture, not just, did you find a granola wrapper on your porch, or did you not pay the rent? But, how do we address this? Again, landlords have a stake in this conversation too, that we don't want to leave that out of the picture. But so I'm really excited. And also the use of navigators. So we've been talking with the Innovation for Justice, and Chris too has been forwarding this at a state level. Interestingly, Arizona is one of 2 states in the country that will allow non-lawyer navigators to give legal advice. So if we can set up a training program with a certificate to train potentially a number of people in our community to be able to be navigators, to do some early intervention with people. And again, with the goal of diverting as many people out of the court system as possible first, but then educating people as to what their options are and how to be prepared to go into the court system if necessary. So, and those navigators could be embedded into an eviction diversion program. And I think really, it's a much, much more cost-effective way of dealing with this eviction issue than just, the system that we currently have that just churns people through.
Just to clarify, that Arizona has recently passed a limited legal license practitioner. That is not a navigator or a social worker that has background in legal issues. That's a new profession that was created by the court and the bar and requires licensing and examination beyond what you're talking about. There are 2 pilot projects that are working to train non-lawyer advocates to provide some measure of legal support, but I'd caution any nonprofit thinking about that it's a very different landscape to have legal assistance within your nonprofit if you are not a law firm. So I think there's a lot of things to sort out there, but just to say that that's a navigator role should not be giving legal advice. Legal advice should be left to attorneys or licensed professionals as defined by the courts.
Good, thanks for that clarification, Chris. But in any case, legal education still can be a significant, part of the tools and less expensive, and maybe a less expensive route. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, Justine, but I think, and I want to say too, Pima County set up a task force this fall that had about 23 different people representing the housing industry, nonprofits, the courts, city and county government, the faith community, to look at evictions. And so there's been more attention on the justice court and what's happening there and how to work from some of the best practices, as well as, what are some other systemic things that we can do. So, I think that's hopeful, but, and I believe the Biden administration will extend this moratorium, but I sure wish they would do it sooner rather than later.
Can I just interrupt for a second? There was a comment several minutes ago, but it was such a good conversation. It's from someone who's here in Pima County, but I don't know who it is. Their number, but he or she says, LA and many other cities are instituting mini homes in open lots and giving services on site that transition to jobs, homes for good. Addressing the system starts with universal daycare and pre-K schooling for all. What do you folks know about the LA system there? And can it work here? Peggy?
I don't know about the LA system, but I can tell about Seattle. I have a colleague and friend who started a mini home project. And basically what they do is the city contributes land, and then they get volunteers to make small homes. And the design is published on their website. They got the city of Seattle to change their development services to allow these mini homes. And then it was prior to the pandemic, but it was an attempt to provide people who had been camping all over Seattle to have a safe place, because we know that people experiencing homelessness have higher experience of violence and become more victims than people that have a home. And then they develop kind of congregate eating areas or, bathroom bathing areas. And they've created actually quite a few of them. And so folks go there before they go into the continuum of care, before they, actually start looking for permanent housing, in partnership with like TPCH, how we through TPCH help folks get more permanent housing. So they go there first, and then they go into the, getting access into the continuum of care and getting more permanent housing. And, that's done a couple of things. It's enabled volunteers to experience what it's like to experience homelessness through developing relationships as they build these homes. And it's also gotten the system of the city to kind of address the fact that gentrification has allowed the proliferation of people not to have a safe place to call home, and addressing some of their systems around that. But, again, it takes a lot of public sector investment and public sector saying, here's land, and you know, we could do something similar. Our city has been great to kind of ease up on people camping. So you'll see tents around the city, and they've partnered with, you know, Beacon and some of the behavioral health agencies to support folks that are in that state. But yeah, I mean, that's in a way another crisis response. It doesn't get to where we really need to be, but it's a way to address the affordable housing crisis.
One of our questions, and we aren't getting to it, which is good, I guess, but was about the homeless camps around Tucson. But what do you think, Justine? Should we go there, or it's 2:07? I know folks probably have things to do.
You're muted, Justine.
Yeah, I think that was just one of the topics that came up for us here in our immediate community, was just the the awareness of an increase in people experiencing homelessness, or at least the visibility of it seems to be more prevalent. And so just thinking about that, is that, it seems to be that there's a correlation between that and, the pandemic. And I think we just kind of wondered if there were folks who might be able to speak to that, who are working in those communities. And, and Peggy, you brought up that there has been a leniency on the part of the city to allow for these things. But at the same time, and people probably all have the Nextdoor app, neighborhood app, and the conversations that are taking place on there are really very negative. So it's, there's this increase, but there isn't any additional sort of education and communication about what's happening. In fact, it seems to kind of engender even more negative feelings for people experiencing homelessness and lack of.
Right.
So I don't know if
Right.
folks.
Eric put a comment in the chat, and Tom's got his hand up. So Eric, do you want to toss your question out there?
Hello, everybody. I guess I've been reflecting on if we really did have living wage in the city of Tucson, what impact can you experts predict it would have on eviction reduction or homelessness reduction?
I know I've read some recent studies, Eric, that show that, it's not surprising when minimum wage goes up, the ability of people to pay their rent increases as well. And I'd have to dig to find it, but I did just read one that was, really making the case that increasing minimum wage has a positive impact on eviction reduction and more housing stability.
So it's a real prevention intervention. I mean, I don't need a number, but it
makes sense, huh? Yeah. Anybody else, Peggy or Tom or anybody? So Tom, you had your hand up. Would you jump in?
Well, I know for us, I think what Eric brings up is really important, and that is that, OPCS, so we do housing, but to also think of the importance of wages and the importance of employment and job availability and creation. And I think sometimes we just really, it's the way the human brain likes to categorize things, right? And so we can't keep data and information unless we somehow catalog it, but then we think it really is separate. And we go about our lives as if these catalog things are separate, and they're certainly not. So this recognition that we're going to have to make movement in all these fronts to have real impact. I know for the folks that we are often trying to partner with, who have this long kind of chronic street homelessness, their current initial and states of homelessness, that living wage won't immediately probably make any difference, because there's lots of other reasons why they're experiencing homelessness. However, once they move out of homelessness and into some place to live, maintaining that and being, obviously wage is going to make a difference. So it really is an everything answer. I was very lucky that when I don't know if I was lucky, but probably lucky. When I first came into this position about 6 years ago, I kind of wiggled my way into some commission. I forget what it was called, but we were trying to figure out with the mayor's office back then, what to invest in. And really what it came down to was a lot of us, trying to get there and see, well, what could we get funding for? And it really opened my eyes to, everything was important. Everybody there, none of them were working on things that were superficial. And the only I heard in my head was we have to do it all. There's otherwise you're raising one and lowering another, and we're competing for energy and funds that really they're all tied together. When it comes to the camps, I think, I look to the day that if we would, and I'm not a big fan of tiny homes, but if we had places for people to stay, and I think that's one potential temporary solution, then you wouldn't have people living in parks, and you could ask people who lived in parks to move on, because our parks weren't really meant for people to camp in. And we could get our public spaces back, and we could, because I see it from both sides. For a long time as nonprofit CEO, we always said, oh, the NIMBY situation. But, I got to be honest, I live in Vail, and if you wanted to open up a 200-bed shelter on my corner at Kayuinkanado and Shasta, I'd probably be concerned about that. So sometimes this idea of, these solutions are negatively impacting other areas, and how do we do it without having that negative impact? And how can we solve those problems and get these public spaces back? People just want to be able to use their parks. And the homeless encampment thing's a real problem, because there isn't somewhere for a lot of people to go. So how can all you're doing is moving them around town. But in the same sense, we have an outreach team that goes out when people call. I also empathize with those neighbors. They're trying to live their life. They're trying to raise their children. And, a big encampment in the wash right behind their wall is probably not what they were looking for. And there's drug usage, there's needles, there's all kinds of problems that come from that. So I think being honest about all the sides of it and trying to bring people together, whereas for a long time in my experience, it was always, oh, the neighbors are not being compassionate enough. And sometimes they are, sometimes they're not being compassionate. People are not compassionate sometimes, but a lot of times I've found that when you talk with them, they want their neighborhood to be nice too. And we have to have other solutions. And right now it's been leave people alone, because that may be the best thing with COVID. But even in the past, it was just kind of move them around. People move from one area to the next until those neighbors get upset. Anyways.
Thanks for that, Tom. And I know something Nahareen raised earlier, it's wondering, how do we make sure more people don't slip into that chronic homelessness situation, right? So these families that are facing eviction who need someplace to land until they can get back on their feet. And that seems to me to be a really big hole. And I would like to mention too, as we talk about systemic solutions, that the moratorium did not have to be structured this way. There's a county, and Peggy, maybe you're familiar with it, in Washington, Multnomah County, which created its own moratorium that prevented evictions from being processed at all, right? And it also prevented both residential and non-residential. So if you were a small business owner who couldn't pay your rent, you couldn't get booted out of your situation. And they created set it for a long period of time. It expires in July. And then they created I can't remember, it's a 6-month time period for a repayment period. So after the eviction ends, or the moratorium ends, there's still 6 months you have to get caught up with your rent. So you're not going to get taken to court, right? Can you imagine the heartache and the confusion and the extra work and energy of all of us in this conversation that could have been prevented if we had a moratorium that was executed in the way we all assumed a moratorium would work, right? That it would prevent the execution of a legal process, right? So that's, just so frustrating. And just to share that so here's the email that just came through, and while we were talking, it says, hi, Bonnie, are you able to help us with rent and bills this month? So the answer is no. No, I can't, because there's a 2-month waiting list you have to get on. And my wife's unemployment benefits were exhausted. And so we're having a little trouble paying our bills. And the landlord has said, and I don't know if Chris is still on the call, the landlord has told us that we've abandoned our apartment again because we haven't paid the bills yet. And I don't understand that, but this isn't the first time someone has gone to court on this position and been evicted on this position that they've abandoned their property, even though they're still living in their apartment. So, you know, here's another person that we're going to have to respond to and deal with. And I don't know, you know, whether that eviction can get prevented.
Well, and Bonnie, I'd just like to say again, if a landlord has an attorney, a tenant needs an attorney. And that's the only way that it's equal. And there are some attorneys, I like to say that I think of like the worst possible landlord attorney, and there are a couple of them that come to mind. And then there's, you know, they're not vilified as a group, but I think of the most difficult one. As a non-lawyer, I would not want to try and put, you know, a tenant's housing in my hands to go up against someone. And so there should be some discussion about a right to counsel when your house and your home is at question. I know we have that for when your liberty is at risk. But until we're at that place, legal services are the way that you're going to address the need of that tenant that's reaching out to you. So I hate to, you know, keep harping on the fact that legal assistance is really important, except that if one side has a lawyer, it's just not fair, no matter how many non-lawyers that are educated you put on the other side of the scale, it's not equal. And so I think part of what we have to talk about is equal access to justice. And there's plenty of things that social workers and navigators can do to help educate tenants about the process, but there's really only one person that can go up against another lawyer, and that's a lawyer.
And we also know that many people have been illegally evicted. And so then trying to get them, I mean, I know we've had folks, and then, you know, trying to advocate and try to get a judge to hear it again, right? To fight that illegal eviction is frustrating. And I'm wondering, are all states like Arizona, where the eviction courts are controlled by the Arizona Supreme Court? Is that true across the US, or are there other more enlightened areas?
Most of them are in a similar jurisdictional setup. A lot of courts have regional or district area courts that serve, you know, I don't know that all of them have elected judges, or that those judges are not licensed attorneys or have had the experience practice in the law. I think for you guys, and maybe you have probably some former legislators who have that experience and bring that to the bench. But those are elected positions. And so anytime that there's politics injected into justice, you're going to end up with variables and outcomes.
You know, Chris, you raised a really interesting point. Until this year, when judges were on the ballot, I usually just didn't vote because I don't know whether they're good or not good, right? So I don't feel like I, you know, want to tip it one way or the other. And this year, boy, have I really seen the importance of who gets elected into those positions. And, you know, that might be another area for us to focus on, to make sure that we have judges in there who are going to be fair and do their job well.
Justine and Bonnie, we have about 10 minutes left. Do you guys want to maybe move to question number 9 and kind of restate that a little bit and present that to the group?
Sure. Yeah, Matt, thank you. All right, so question, and then I also wanted to kind of, I also had been thinking really quickly. I think it's very intentional that the book is Poverty and Profit in the American City, and to kind of go back to some things brought up earlier in the conversation, right? You know, he makes a point of saying that poverty is not just the result of low incomes, but it's also a result of extractive markets, right? I mean, and we are all, you know, and what Peggy was talking about, it's kind of like, and scaling, getting back at the bigger picture. And I don't have a very sophisticated sort of understanding of this, but that was something that was really resonated personally for me. And, you know, I think it was, we were looking at Sharina, and I think that at many times we probably bristled at just some of her responses, and also, you know, looking at maybe even the actions of the tenants themselves and sort of with judgment. But I think we were really meant to kind of look at just our own, you know, Desmond kind of asks us to look at our role, the things that we benefit from too, in the larger, right, policies that enable us to live in the ways that we do, the tax benefits we get for being homeowners, you know, and all of those things. And so I just wanted to kind of put that out there. And also, so one of the kind of final question was, you know, this does seem like a call to action, and wondering again, and we're all sitting here talking, but did it, you know, and in what way do you see yourself and your work kind of responding to this call? I mean, many of you have shared that, but some of the folks maybe who have not had a chance to speak, and within your institutions individually.
I'd kind of like to ask how, you know, libraries and this, we're oftentimes the first point of contact that we have with people who just got kicked out. You know, they come to the library wanting help. So you know, how can we help as kind of hubs of the community?
This is Dean with Public Defense Services. We've been made aware of some efforts to provide legal representation for tenants, and I've made it clear that my department is ready to implement whatever if the board passes something, we're willing to implement whatever they put into place. So we're ready to provide administrative support and get an organization up and running if there's a push to create something for representation.
That's great, Dean. Thank you. And I wanted, before, as we are coming on the time where we will be ending, Noreen brought up something, and here she said another important issue that the constable, well, Noreen, if you want to speak, actually, if you would like to bring that up, I will.
Hey, just wanted to touch on, you know, the large amount of elderly people who have limited Social Security income are being evicted. You know, they're making maybe $700 a month and paying rent that's $600, and so they can't, you know, they're constantly getting behind and then go through eviction and have to get into housing that's just not, you know, suitable for them. There's just such limited affordable housing. You know, I think that I know we talked about this previously, but we just have to bring it up again.
Peggy and Tom can correct me, but Marcos Ismail told me that the National Low Income Housing Coalition says we are about 50,000 affordable housing units short. 50,000.
Is that
Yeah. I would say the same thing, that there's also, and I think there's a lot of changes happening in Tucson in the City Department of Housing and Community Development, and there's much more flexibility in voucher programs than has typically been taken advantage of here in Tucson. And you know, things have to change by the market, and so a voucher that could be helpful in one situation is not enough money for this apartment or that apartment, and those are the only apartments that are available. So you have to find ways to then increase those those vouchers. As I think others have mentioned, the market is not going to provide the kind of housing that's needed. And so that has to be funded in some way. So how do you do that without creating big slums, to be frank? How do you do that without saying, oh, we're creating big, humongous public housing communities and concentrating poverty and challenges in one area versus integrating and letting folks live in the community where they choose and select. So I'm a big proponent of the voucher programs. I think that's the way to go. It has a lot of problems and bureaucracy, but it makes more sense. The trick is, how do you get more affordable housing units built without creating these big? That's a challenge. Peggy may know, and others may know more about the low income housing tax credits in that. It seems like a very complicated thing to me. I'm not sure how it works. It seems like a lot of developers could make a lot of money, but I'm not really sure how much housing comes out of it. Others may know. I'm leery, as you can tell, but having that housing. I remember a while back, Peggy, you had a project in which people could lease a room, and then you had the bathroom down the hall, kind of a setup. So how do we have housing that isn't just a one size fits all and it's cheaper and it meets my needs? And I don't have to necessarily be homeless to know, well, this meets my needs better.
Yeah, we really need a variety of housing for all different kinds of folks, and it should be choice housing, exactly what you said. Actually, the housing we develop, we don't go the LIHTC way, because it can become unaffordable down the road. And also because we like to do smaller and do kind of infill so that it participates in the neighborhood. So it's more of a comprehensive community development piece, of which housing is one of them. But that takes philanthropy, because government doesn't invest in that. So if you don't want to do the huge, you got to do at least 50 units for LIHTC, low income housing tax credit. So if you want to do it a different way, then you have to do philanthropy. So it's a challenge, and you want to make sure that the units are at 30% of what folks make, right? So that's the other critical piece. It means you have to have a lot of investment to keep the units affordable over a long time. So yeah, it's challenging.
Well, I think we're at the end of our time. Matt, do you want to wrap us up?
Well, I don't really know how to wrap us up. It's kind of really sobering and daunting, what we face here as professionals. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who participated today. It was very enlightening and like I said, sobering. And it's a hard thing to tackle, and you guys are doing the great work out there to tackle it. So I thank you again. And this was a great talk. Justine and Bonnie, do you want to say anything?
Just very grateful for everybody's, time and compassion and heart on this conversation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I want to just kind of echo those sentiments. I'm really grateful for all of the work that each of you are doing, and I'm really appreciative of this time and your sharing your knowledge with us. And I think that's really important going forward, So thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.